Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University, and welcome to Outrider 22, the Uberfication of the Doctorate. And this session is dedicated to Piper. So what we're going to do today is we're going to think about the transformations to learning, the transformations to teaching, to research, to knowledge. We're thinking about you and the positioning of you and your research in the contemporary university. And we're going to look at really the last 40 years, but particularly focus on what has occurred post-COVID. You see, we now have a group of students entering our doctoral program who are underprepared in the post-COVID environment. Now, I've spent a lot of time in Canada in the last 18 months, 2 years or so, before I came to Charles Darwin University, and I've talked with a lot of colleagues throughout the sector in Canada. And if there's one trope that they all share, it is the fear that their students are underprepared when they're entering a PhD, when they're entering a doctorate. The fear from our science colleagues is that students have simply not spent enough time at the bench, and there's going to be consequences of that. For our colleagues in the humanities and the social sciences, the fear is the students just simply have not read enough and read it at a high enough level. Ooh, this is interesting. So we've also got a generation of students that didn't really have to come to lectures or indeed have to participate in these online seminars and tutorials. And I always laugh as a metaphor when we focus on those students that made a decision to turn their camera off. And I understand, body dysmorphia and stuff, that's cool. But trust me, everybody that had their camera off during those seminars and lectures and tutorials did not have body dysmorphia. And I think the turning of the camera off in a learning environment, in a learning experience, is a wider metaphor of a disconnection from complicated teaching and learning, a disconnection from the desire or the imperative to be challenged in one's space, to be expected to read at the highest theoretical levels. Think about it, we've got a generation, they're about to, in a doctoral program, use multi-million pound, dollar, euro equipment. We've got students that are about to go into a synchrotron. And yet what experience have they had at the bench? And of course, this is another rendering of the long COVID that we're going to talk about today. But mostly we're going to talk about the three generations that circulate in the contemporary university. Baby boomers, Generation X, and yes, millennials. And I want to look at the impact of Uberfication on our universities and these three generations that still populate higher education. So what is Uberfication? Uberfication is a concept developed by the legendary Professor Gary Hall. I know Gary a little bit, respects Gary. Gary has had a remarkable career. He's, I suppose, best known for his theorisation of post-digital studies. Excellent paradigm, I recommend it to you. And he spent the bulk of his career now at the University of Coventry. So Gary, you're a legend, and this is a great book. And Gary published The Uberfication of the University with the University of Minnesota Press in 2016, and this is really interesting. This book was part of a series for the University of Minnesota Press that was called the Forerunner series. I'm a bit obsessed by it, I absolutely love it. And they described this series as written between fresh ideas and finished books. They described it as a form of grey literature. How interesting is this? And they argue that this series has very strong relationships with social media. I'm very excited about this series. I might see if I can write something to go into this series. This is exciting. But other great books in this series, for example, are, I love this book, Ian Bogost's The Geek's Chihuahua, Living with Apple. What a great title that is. And Stephen Shaviro's No Speed Limit, 3 essays on acceleration, which I've cited heavily, a wonderful book. So for Hall, the Uberfication of our universities details how the financial crisis was not an ending for neoliberalism, but in fact increased the privatisation, the deregulation, and decreased the critiques of the private sector, decreased our critiques of arguing the state needs to regulate. Wow. So this means that the university has become part of the post-welfare capitalist society, where labour was reorganised and academics became micro-entrepreneurs. Most importantly, the university has moved from a state-regulated enterprise to part of the sharing economy. And just as we've moved from the deregulation of hotels and the deregulation of taxis, we've got data management and data intermediaries like Uber, for example, and Airbnb that have replaced that regulation. We now have a sharing economy and regulation is avoided. It's also termed platform capitalism, where everyone is a supplier, everyone is a content generator, there are no maximum hours for work, and workers are isolated. Now, this was also tracked through the movement from the free MOOCs movement to what is now the really, really expensive MOOCs movement. LinkedIn purchased lynda.com, that great, professional development little organisation platform, in April 2015. So this meant, really for the first time, social media, social networking became providers of education. Now, neoliberalism is a word that's used a lot, and most of the time it's used inaccurately. But let's get to the fundamentals. What is neoliberalism? It is privatisation, deregulation, and a critique of the public sector. That's what neoliberalism is. And obviously this is particularly problematic for universities because universities are part of the public sector mostly. With alternative providers suddenly emerging, this sort of cheap alternative access to education as a service emerged. Now, all our sectors currently are highly underregulated, with arguments emerging that it's all about customers, and as long as customers can make a choice via competition, then the product will improve, even if that product is higher education. Yeah, right. So we're living in this system right now. This is our system. Think about all the weird stuff that we've sort of taken for granted, like rate your professor. My goodness me, is your professor hot? Chilies. Yeah, nah. So rate your professor, student evaluations, and of course, league tables, unbelievably, for international universities. Now, Hall stated, and I love this phrase, I've really taken this on deeply. Hall stated that this is, quote, auditing a way to manage academics, end of quote. Wow. Okay, so at this point, it's really important that we remember the history of our universities. Through much of the history of universities, and I'm talking for centuries, we worked on a patronage model, that is, a guild model. So white men taught other white men using homology. Academics did not have teaching qualifications. They used to lecture, to speak their knowledge, so that knowledge would then move as a transmission to the next generation of scholars. And assessment protocols, very straightforward: examination, oral examination, and essays. So this was based on the medieval churches, a highly underregulated space, and formed during the early modern period. So we're talking really, I suppose, the late 15th century through to the early 18th century, and exemplified through the University of Paris model. Students were controlled by faculty masters, and they were referred to as masters, to conform to the standards of a university. So in the Oxford model, a tutorial system was put in place, and it is and remains pretty well a decentralised model. So through all these models, the sociology of the student body and what's going on here, the socialisation, is really clear. The student and the workplace model was based on the white man. And that white man had a wife who completed the actual life tasks. So she was completely under-recognised for the work that she did to allow the white male academic to be successful. Now, we still have some models like that circulating in our university to this day. For many of the baby boomer men that still work in our universities, now in their late 60s and early 70s and still working in the university sector, they were educated when very few women were classmates, very few women were colleagues, and of course they very, very rarely, if ever, worked for a female boss. So they've had a stability of employment that is beyond the imaginings of most of us. And their understanding of university work, including PhD supervision, is very, very different from the other generations that are circulating in our universities. And I'll give you two recent examples of my engagement as a Generation Xer, my engagement with two of these colleagues. So two men refused to complete 10 minutes of supervisory training to put themselves on a supervisory register. So all they had to do to be on a supervisory register and be able to supervise was complete 10 minutes of professional development and write 250 words. And they both refused. One gentleman was 70 years of age, one gentleman was 69 years of age, and they've worked in very, very few universities through their career, and they've had the gift of a good, regular paycheck. And they stated that they won't be doing any training because one stated, quote, "I don't do administration," end of quote, and the other one stated, quote, "I don't have time," end of quote. Just a reminder, 10 minutes of content. Okay, so intriguingly, both of these gentlemen reported to me that they had 20 PhD completions through their career. And you see, this is where the generational complexity emerges, because they assumed that 20 PhD completions is a high number, and that I would be impressed. Perhaps I would be intimidated. But no. Because, of course, the sociology of our doctoral programs has changed through the widening participation agenda. So there are many, many more higher degree students right now than have ever been in the history of our universities. So actually 20 PhD completions is a very, very low number, and we would be expecting that from pretty an early to mid-career academic. So let alone somebody with a 45 plus year career. We would be expecting many more completions than that. But as you can see here, we've got still a group in our culture, in our university culture, that has grown up, been educated, worked in an under-regulated system where they continue to educate people as they were educated. Homology. And there can be no critiques of this system of education, this system, this way of being an academic, because it's experiential. They have a data set of one, which is supposedly generalisable. Yeah, nah. The difficulty is that the world, higher education, higher degrees, have changed radically. Through the late 1980s and through the 1990s, the widening participation agenda emerged in our university. And all of a sudden, women, older students, mature age students, as the language of the time described them, Indigenous colleagues, students of colour, students with an impairment, rainbow students started to be much more visible in our systems. So all of a sudden, homology just didn't work at all, because these students had a life experience far beyond the young man who went to university and then stayed. Now, at this point, regulation started to emerge in the higher education system and workforce. Requirements for teaching and learning emerged. Double marking, assessment committees, benchmarks, external examiners in some systems, including the United Kingdom, big hi to all my mates in the UK. So teaching and learning started to be checked, verified, and regulated. And suddenly, any sort of activity behind a closed lecture theatre door or a tutorial or seminar room started to be scrutinised, started to be assessed. So teaching experience was not enough, expertise was required. Similarly for research, research started to be regulated and audited. We think about ethics in particular. Ethics has become enormous, quite rightly, in the last 30 years. And of course, post the Vancouver Protocol, research authorship, research integrity started to be questioned and then checked with increasing formality through journals themselves. Now, this was the period of Generation X. Generation X was born between 1961 and 1981. This generation would see incredibly volatile economic conditions, recession after recession after recession, multiple jobs, multiple really poor contracts, moving between cities and states and provinces and countries just to stay in work. And they also saw, and probably experienced bullying, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. Therefore, this generation welcomed regulation, welcomed state intervention to stop the abuse of students and postdocs and colleagues. Stop the bullying. Stop the theft of authorship and research. Most of us have seen and experienced the toxic consequences of patronage, and it has now been studied with the longitudinal studies in the peer-reviewed research. So this is a model of higher education that is comfortable with regulation, comfortable with governance, to hold the perpetrators accountable for their actions. And universities therefore started to become this battleground of this very, very well-educated Generation X that had done teaching qualification, had done teacher training, so they knew what was going on in education beyond the individual experience. And then, of course, the baby boomers who continued with homology. But of course, there's one more generation to discuss, and that's the millennials, born between, let's say, 1981 and 1996. They grew up with social media, digitisation, what's often called accelerated culture, and they grew up where neoliberalism had infiltrated all our systems and all our structures. Everything became a shopping expedition. Everything became consumerism. Everything became commodified. And indeed, from Generation X, from my generation, we were paying for our degrees. So my degrees had fees. I was in the first generation that had fees. And of course, these payments for education created very odd cultures. It created student debt and also a commodification of knowledge. If you're paying for a degree, should you pass it? Therefore, let's reconnect this generational story of universities to the Uberfication story of universities and see where we're going now. And we need to just remember these three generations are currently circulating in our universities. Yep, right now. So there are many different workforces that exist in our universities. We've got certainly the tenured, stable staff who have been in tenure 20, 30, 40 years. Yes, they can be now restructured at any point, removed from the organisation. But you see, they've been able to sustain stable employment for 30, 35, 40, 45 years, with all the consequences on creating stable housing and a stable family structure, right? But most jobs in universities right now are radically insecure positions, contract positions where students and academics are just living with stress and loneliness and depression and despair. You see, what's happening is we've got a group of casualised staff, 0-hour contract staff, if you will, that are subsidising our universities. There's no other way to present it. So we've got a group of people that are completing very high-level tasks, high-level work in our universities for which they are paid very little. And adjunct supervisors are the archetype of that. They are paid nothing to supervise PhD students. Highest of highest job, highest of highest task, for which they are paid nothing. Okay, so Zizek described this as, quote, a strategic withdrawal of intellectual and bodily labour, end of quote. Fewer staff are teaching critical and difficult courses anymore because the student reviews rate a professor high, because student reviews will rate those courses and that academic as difficult, as complex, as difficult to pass, and of course unable to get the student a job. Now, Hall stated, quote, there is a real danger that the range of those who have the opportunities to create, publish and disseminate adventurous, or what we may call courageous, political and critical scholarship and research may grow even narrower in the future, end of quote. Yep. The need is real to manage a reputation management, and manage reputation through high teaching and learning evaluation scores. And the reason people have to do that now is so that their semester-long contract will be renewed. They need a good teaching review, or else they won't be hired next semester and have no income. And therefore, what happens to the preparedness of students moving into a higher degree if these easy courses are being enacted? All of the arguments, of course, I've specified so far in this Outrider are pre-COVID discussions. Then a pandemic hits, and students have to be accountable and responsible for their own learning. But were they? How many of those online lectures were unviewed? How many of those kitchen science experiments were actually done? How many of those amazing science kits that so many universities prepared and sent to a student's home, how many of those science kits were actually ever used? Well, we're about to find out in our doctoral programs. Now, a PhD is hard. Most of the world will never complete a PhD. Most of the world will never even have a chance of getting into a PhD program. But what happens to our doctoral programs when the standards in our university are Uberfied? Well, students are going to demand a lot more of their supervisors because they're buying a service. So if they're buying a service, do they expect to pass? Supervisors will be rated. So the supervisors that will be rated for their speedy and successful completions, and of course that's already happening, by the way. See, most universities have a database of the length of candidates for every single student. As Dean, I have a list of every single student and every single supervisor at this university for the last 10 years. I know how long every single student took to complete their candidature, and I know how long supervisors take to complete their students as a mean, a mode, and an average, right? So I know exactly what's going on. I have that data now. I know exactly what's going on. But that data set, and every university does, but that data set is not public at this point. When will we, in our Uberfication, reach the point where those Excel spreadsheets are suddenly made public so students can see successful supervisors like an Uber rating? And this means there's going to be a lot more focus on supervisors, a lot more focus on supervisory quality. And remember, I'm Gen X. I'm in favour of full regulation of higher education. I'm in favour of full regulation of doctoral education. Full stop. I want strong policies on supervisory behaviour. I want strong policies on authorship. I want strong policies on bullying. But regulation is different from ratings determined by a student. So if a supervisor makes it easier for a student, will they get a better rating? Think about this in your own life, right? What would you rate as important when you're assessing a supervisor? Think about that. What do you think as a student is important when you're assessing and ranking a supervisor? Are you ranking the right stuff? How do you know? You've got a data point of 1. You've got your supervision. That's not a generalisable data set. And what are we going to do if, and indeed when, the standards of a PhD decline post-COVID? Now, this is not a hypothetical question. I recently, and by recently I mean in the last 2 weeks, examined 2 PhD theses. I examined about 20 or 30 a year. It's important so I can maintain standards. And I recently examined these 2, and these 2 theses, hang on to yourself, did not present a reference list or a bibliography. I wish I was joking. How is a thesis supervised and sent to an examiner who happens to be a Dean of Graduate Studies without a bibliography or a reference list? Seriously. So what is going to happen when the impact of COVID and neoliberalism entwine in the second half of this decade? Well, absolutely, your supervisors will be rated. And this neoliberalism is going to have very interesting consequences. The nature of competition is that the poor supervisors will lose students. Okay, now regulation would have also achieved that, just in a different way. But neoliberal competition will also achieve that. So what happens to you as a higher degree student when you are configured, as de Soto and de Mayo stated, as consumers? What happens when a PhD student becomes a consumer? How will the casualised workforce manage the student consumer? Let me state that again. How will the casualised university workplace manage this student consumer? That's the question of our time. Now, Colin Arnold described this as, quote, a moment of crisis in higher education, end of quote. What happens is our universities are no longer invested in the public good. There is a focus on personal responsibility. Now, Colin Arnold answers his own question. He believes that the consequences of this new system will be the people in power will continue to reinforce their own power. Universities, quote, solidify advantage, end of quote. They've done this throughout their history, obviously, with that sort of short 20-year window of the widening participation agenda. So the patronage model is now being bought, sold, and repackaged as neoliberalism. To make themselves competitive in this Uberfied system, universities are investing in all sorts of logos and branding devices. When in doubt, let's have a new brand. Let's invent a new logo, because that really matters. And of course, what the logo or the branding does is explains how they're so much better than all those other universities. And that's why, of course, so much focus is on these prestige rankings, like the Times Higher rankings, for example. But the question is, for me, what happens to the PhD supervisor during this Uberfication? Supervisors will need to service their student consumers, and supervisors will be monitored and assessed publicly. The key question, though, is what happens to PhD examiners through this Uberfication? Now, the standard of theses may drop. It may drop. But as long as examiners do not pass those theses, then the standards of doctoral education will be sustained. Low-level theses must not be rewarded with a degree, or else the degree is meaningless. Therefore, any pressure on examiners, any dodgy processes to manage an examination system must be watched, must be checked, and hell yeah, must be called out every single time. Because completing a PhD is not like riding an Uber. It must be assessed by examiners. And students may complain about their supervisors, their university, their research training. They may complain about their scholarships, about their fees. Absolutely. But everything in a doctoral program is about the quality assurance moment from the examiners. Students can rate their supervisor, but examiners will assess them and assess their research. The final question, I think, is really what is going to happen to PhD supervisors through the stress of this Uberfication. And Ali Padjab and Martin Lugren, in an article published in 2023, actually a couple of weeks ago, so it's a great, fantastic article, titled their particular article, Stress in Doctoral Education. And they provided a good answer, I think, to what is going to happen in our future. They interviewed PhD supervisors and they found a laundry list of stresses: time pressure, balancing any sense of work and personal or private time, organisational and administrative factors, engagement with students' personal issues, and relationships with co-supervisors, just to name a few. And they showed that supervisors are now locked in survival mode. They showed the benefit of supervisory training, which of course is mandatory in their home nation of Sweden, and the importance of generating training to address and manage this stress. I've taken good notice of that for our colleagues at CDU. I'll be doing some of that work. Significantly, they also show the reputational damage that will be caused through supervisory experiences and the impact of that reputational damage on supervisors' careers. Wow. Now, Kirikou stated that there is a fear of dismissal for incompetence, a fear of losing face, a fear of losing esteem. And so hang on to yourself. What they argue all this means is that undertrained, undereducated supervisors who are not skilled in the research process will make mistakes through their research and supervisory process and then mask those errors through fear of reputational damage. The consequences of that on research integrity are enormous. So their reputation may be impacted. So because they don't want their reputation impacted, they'll mask the errors. Ooh. Therefore, we need to critique at every single opportunity the generalisability of a data set of one. A supervisor endlessly talking about their doctoral experience as if it is generalisable. When I did my PhD, we don't care. It's a data set of one. It's not generalisable. And it's certainly not generalisable to a very different time in our universities. But it is important, as Cornwall et al. Affirmed, that students do understand the profound difficulties that are impacting on supervisors at the moment, impacting on any sense of academic work and academics' private life. Now, so many of my friends, my wonderful friends out there, are an academic, but to be an academic, they're working at 3 different universities on 3 different contracts, living in Airbnbs and basically living their life on a train, moving between cities. These neoliberal universities are absolutely ruthless. And remember, one of the reasons I talk about Jamie and I so often is I want you to see in real time the consequences of these neoliberal universities on actual humans. To do the job that Jamie and I do for students and for our colleagues as just middle managers in regional universities, we have no private life. We've had to park our private life. We work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. And further, we don't have the help of a spouse to help us in that job. My spouse is not only in a different city or a different university, my spouse is in a different country. And the consequences of that create despair. Despair. This is our present. And you know what? It's your future. Uberfication seems convenient. It seems easy. Opening an app, tracking a car, offering a rating, great. Quick and easy. But higher education, let alone a PhD, is not quick and easy. It is difficult. It is uncomfortable. It is challenging. Because you have to learn and you have to test yourself every single day. But as these three generations continue to mix in our universities, I wanted to offer one final story of hope in this very dark Outrider. I won't name the supervisor, but she's young. She's a millennial. She's just finished her own PhD. And she's about to supervise her first student. And she came and saw me and said, would I supervise this student with her? And I said, yes, that's great. And she asked, how do I get onto the supervisory register? Asked me, but how do I get onto the supervisory register? And she had done the training within 24 hours to get onto the supervisory register. And then the next day, she sat with me and talked through issues and talked through the readings that she'd done that I'd recommended to just get some clarity on key issues. How terrific is this? And she looked at me, and I won't get emotional, she looked at me in my office and she said, quote, I want to be a really, really, really good supervisor. End of quote. Now, I got teary, I'm getting teary now, got teary, and I gave her a hug. She's one of our futures if we choose to accept it. Well educated, published, continues to do professional development, and wants to learn, wants to improve, so that she can become the best supervisor that she can be. Not because she's rated like an Uber driver, but because it is a privilege to supervise. And she wants to give it her best. So while remarkable people like this exist in our universities, we have a future. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.